Welcome to Eat, Drink, Think. I'm Amy O'Neill Hauk. In this podcast from Edible Communities, a network of magazines published across North America, we celebrate all things local and sustainable in the food world. Today, we're speaking with Austin Frerick, author of Barron's, Money, Power, and the Corruption of America's Food Industry. Austin is an expert on agricultural and antitrust policy. He's a fellow at Yale University working on an initiative that brings together faculty, students, and scholars to collaborate on research related to competition policy and antitrust enforcement. And he's worked for political campaigns crafting agricultural antitrust policy. Austin is a seventh-generation Iowan, and his connection to the state led to his discovery of the hog farmers that drove him to write Barron's. The book uses the idea of barons, individuals and families who have surprising outsized control in the food industry, to share the danger that monopoly poses not only to our food system, but to our democracy. Austin, welcome to Eat, Drink, Think.
Thanks for having me on, Amy.
Absolutely. Well, first, I want to just say Barron's is a compelling page-turner. You do an excellent job of creating a narrative in each of the 7 Food Baron chapters, on top of telling their stories and connecting them to how our industrial food system got to where it is today. You weave in accessible, digestible, and totally necessary, frankly, history lessons about democracy, monopoly, agriculture, and more. Can you tell us a little bit about the stories you included and how you arrived at the structure for the book?
Yeah, so the way I kind of think of this book as each robber baron is telling a bigger structural story. I'm using them as narrative devices to tell this. And so I first figured out what concepts I really want the reader to know. Because part of it is I just never felt like there was something accessible out there explaining what is the Farm Bill, the history of it, what does it do? So I figured out those concepts, and then I started going out to figure out, well, which robber barons do I want to use to tell these bigger stories? And I purposely wanted to change up the different type of stories. I didn't want to tell the same story over and over. So like my book opens with I call it it's my hog baron, but to me, they're really my trashy Florida money. And then I go to a Cargill, which is my grain baron, and I kind of view them more as like a waspy, aristocratic, old money. So I kind of just wanted to change it up for the reader. And then also I joked the other day, I have a whole list, like B-side list of barons that didn't make the final cut because sure, there's a carrot baron out there, but I wasn't sure what bigger structural point I wanted to make with them.
So the size of the companies in your book is kind of unfathomable. My guests often have varying views about how necessary the industrial part of the industrial food system is. What's your take on the importance of scale when it comes to feeding the population?
I kind of view it like a Goldilocks thing. There is a sweet spot. You do need scale to some degree. I think the undercurrent in my book is just things have just gone too far. Things are out of whack. Because let's not forget, the goal of any corporate executive of any company is monopoly. And we know from history, there's all these negative effects from monopoly, from stifling innovation, farmers, workers, what have you, being shortchanged. But on top of it, just inferior products. And so that's kind of the point of my book is, I don't want to romanticize the past, but things have gone off the rails in the last few decades. We kind of lost that balance in the food system. And so one of my big points too is the system we have now is radical. It is radical that one family does 5 million hogs. And a lot of these reforms, what we're trying to get back to is actually very traditional.
Mm-hmm. And actually, one of the kind of galling things you discuss in the book is that consolidation is allowed often under the guise of efficiency that's supposed to benefit consumers. Can you talk about how and why that happens?
Yeah, so that's the big theme of my Coffee Baron chapter. So that one was honestly the hardest chapter to write because that is not a linear chapter, but I was determined to include that one. And that whole chapter is about the history of antitrust. And I tell it through the story of the secret German family that entered the American coffee markets in 2012, JAB Holding. Most people have never heard of them, but trust me, you probably have one of their brands in the last month or so. They first bought Peet's Coffee in 2012, and then they quickly bought Panera, Krispy Kreme, Pret a Manger, those little Keurig cups, and a bunch of other coffee and bagel brands. To now they sell more coffee than Starbucks. And so I tell the history of antitrust in America going back to Teddy Roosevelt with a man named Louis Brandeis, who really ushered in an anti-monopoly framework. How we know with concentrated economic power that corrupts the political system, especially when it's through non-organic growth, when it's just a bunch of mergers and stuff. And that framework held throughout America for most of the 20th century. And then you really start to see the collapse of it under the Reagan administration with a man I talk about, Robert Bork. Most people know him as being Reagan's failed Supreme Court nominee, but his intellectual contribution was mainly centered in dismantling this antitrust framework and ushering in this massive consolidation. He created something called the Consumer Welfare Standard, which is just a fancy econ way of saying if merging companies combine, do they lower prices for consumers? And you can, I mean, my hot take is you can hire any economist, produce the numbers you want, and it's incredibly lucrative. I mentioned one Chicago economist has made over $100 million doing this kind of pseudoscience. And the big thing, actually, what's really fascinating right now is the President Biden appointed a young woman named Lena Khan to the Federal Trade Commissioner. And she's actually really rooted in this in this neo-Brandeis framework of going back to the old framework of antitrust power. And what I find fascinating and actually really hopeful is how bipartisan it is. I mean, you had Representative Matt Gaetz praising her in the Wall Street Journal just a few weeks ago.
Yeah, I think you've mentioned that a couple different places in the book, how people who consider themselves conservative and people who consider themselves maybe more liberal seem to agree or overlap on the idea of a distrust of this corporate consolidation. Do you think that has ripple effects at all politically?
Oh, totally. I mean, actually, I find that's what I gravitate towards. Is I'm a big believer in that real reforms happen in America when weird bedfellows get together. And especially meatpacking. I mean, meatpacking is one of the most interesting bipartisan spaces. I mean, you have Elizabeth Warren working with Josh Hawley in Missouri on this stuff. I mean, I was very intentional too with my book of kind of show it took two sides to tango. Both parties kind of contributed to this point, but also being very intentional of getting into different news outlets. I mean, the American Conservative has praised my book. And I think also now people are just so sick of complaining, focusing on the negative. People want the positiveness of what it could be and putting together this interesting bipartisan coalition for it. Because just everyone kind of sees it's not working. They see it in different ways, but in the day, the system's just not, it's only working for a few.
And that idea about consumer benefit, which I think you call myth in the book, I mean, as far as the fact that the way people are suffering from inflation and actual consumer prices now, do they see that connection, or is it maybe a little too obscure to understand for regular? I mean, as a consumer, are we making the connections between inflation and consolidation?
People are starting to. I mean, I joked I could write a whole book on just the myth industry perpetuates that just aren't true. And my favorite one is the system is cheap. I mean, I even believe that. I mean, I spent 5 years writing this book, and it wasn't until just a few months before I went to publication that I actually dug into it. And you're like, oh, wait, that's not factually true. Dollar for dollar, Americans spend more money on food than most other Western democracies, but which we shouldn't be surprised, though. I mean, concentrated markets gouge. And I would argue the food industry is probably the most concentrated industry in America. There's just this illusion of choice. So people don't see it. And on top of it, when we talk about it at a national level. But if you're a cattle rancher in Montana, you're not going to take your cattle to Oklahoma to be slaughtered, or you're not going to buy, you know what I mean? These things are food's much more regional markets. So the fact that one company has an 85% market share on the East Coast, you just assume gouging is going on. And so I think people are seeing it. I mean, people, especially in meat and dairy, that's how usually most people judge a grocery store. And this stuff it just doesn't make sense. I mean, if there's one graph I could include in my book, it's actually on the beef markets. What Americans spend on beef goes up and up every year, but what the rancher gets is essentially flat. And that's just a classic tale of monopoly grabbing those profits.
You mentioned in the book that ranching beef cattle is a little different from pork because there are still farmers or ranchers that own their own cattle. And does that give more opportunity perhaps to make changes that go back to more protections in that industry versus the hogs? Yeah. Or chickens.
I call it the chickenization of everything.
Mm.
It's funny because it's I kind of joked to my husband the other day, you can kind of blame chickens on everything. Because a year ago, when we wrote regulations in response to Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, and all that stuff, we didn't write chicken into the regulations. And that's because there weren't commercial chicken slaughterhouses. You just had a chicken in your backyard and you killed it. So what happened in the South is corporations took that exploitive model to black farmers, that sharecropping model, and applied it to chicken. And here's And kind of another big thing in my book too is how much USDA kind of failed in all these different instances. And chicken started getting a massive amount of market share because, it was engaged in sharecropping. Really, you know what I mean? There's a reason why, most chicken farmers live in poverty. But, instead it allowed a race to the bottom. So, pork was chickenized, and then like Driscoll's was my berry baron. And, they sell 1 in 3 berries, but they don't grow single berries because they use the chicken model. And cattle is kind of the last one standing because it's harder to do that industrial model in cattle production. Doesn't mean they're trying, but also the ranchers tend to be better organized. And they also see what happened to other industries. So they're screaming for help now because, their spot market's collapsing. And, these meat companies are essentially trying to doing that chicken model to them.
So we've had an episode about regenerative chicken farming in the last year, but for our listeners that maybe haven't heard that yet, can you talk about the chicken model? Just give us a brief overview.
So depending on who you're talking to, some people call it the tournament system. Some people call it the Southern model. But it really is if you're a chicken farmer in America today, you are given the bird and you're given the feed. You don't ever own the animal. You basically babysit it. You take on a ton of debt to build a metal shed to the company's specifications. You babysit the bird. You then give the bird back to the company. They weigh it in a room you cannot see, and they pay you what is called a tournament system. So whoever adds the most weight to the bird gets paid the most. Here's the thing. If I don't like you, I give you the run of the litter, you add the lease, and you eventually go bankrupt because the margins are so tight here. Keep in mind, even the best chicken farmers are barely surviving. This is an old stat, but like 70% chicken farmers in America live in poverty. And then you're seeing all these, Tyson's just closed a bunch of chicken slaughterhouses in the South. And then all these farmers who took on debt with these production contracts for Tyson's plants, all of a sudden having to go bankrupt because, these metal sheds are built to the company specifications and, there's nothing they can do.
Mm-hmm. And the chickens themselves never leave those.
No, they
houses.
never. That's the story. Even dairy cows. That's the one that actually bothers me the most. Is a lot of dairy cows now. They live inside confinements in the north, or they live out in the desert in the south, but they'll never see a blade of grass.
Do you think that the new regulation in California about hog confinement is going to have a ripple effect?
Yes, but let's talk about that regulation. It's basically saying, so these hogs, they're stuffed into these metal sheds, and these mothers are basically pinned so they couldn't move. And we're just saying, give them a few more inches. The fact that this was an battle over giving an animal confined that was basically pinned down a few more inches shows you how broken the system is. That there's so much money spent for teeny tiny bit of decency to an animal. It's just morally wrong. That is, and the whole hog industry is there's a really dark side to the hog industry too, where the largest packer in America is Smithfield, which is owned by the WH Group of China. And they're actually the largest owner of hogs too. They own 1 in 4, 1 in 5 hogs. And so there's just this really dark undercurrent. I have a hog baron. I opened my book with a hog baron. And the open secret in Iowa is if you build one of these metal sheds and you say you put 2,499 pigs in it, it's a different regulatory structure. But the open secret is they put 4,000 or 5,000 pigs in them. So they cram them in there. And no one, there's just no policing of this. They're incredibly toxic on so many different levels. I wouldn't put animal welfare on the top of my priority list, but this model is just incredibly cruel, especially for dairy cows and pigs.
It makes me wonder, with regard to the California legislation, I just get the feeling that there's a little bit of self-congratulatoriness going on. They're like, oh, we did it. We improved. But you're saying that improvement is so tiny. I wonder if that might lead to less initiative to do more because they're like, okay, we did a thing.
Let me preface this by saying there was a lot of work for them to get that.
Right.
And again, I don't mind them, but it's just industry has gone so far off. You have the fact that Farm Bureau is defending this model. You have an organization that's gotten bigger as their membership has collapsed. So many of these quote voices of the farmer quote voices of agriculture are just fronts for agribusiness. They're exploiting that image we have of people to undermine them. So the thing in California is we've gone so far. The system we have now is really radical. I can't say that enough.
In the Coffee Barons chapter, you say monopoly and democracy, it turns out, don't easily coexist. Can you talk a bit about that and maybe how our collective memory allows for these waves of monopoly to form over and over?
I'm glad you asked about that, because that's why I was determined to include that chapter, is that history has been lost and underappreciated, where monopolists finance fascists. And I think that's an especially important point given this moment in the world. After World War II, Congress commissioned a report. How did this happen? And one of the big findings were monopolists finance fascists. So part of our post-World War II reconstruction was we broke up companies in Europe and Japan. So like Hitler's largest donor was a chemical company called IG Farben. There's a fantastic book on this called Hell's Cartel. And that company was broken up into 7 different ones, including modern day Bayer. And so the secret German family at Profile and Coffee, they got their start in the chemical industry, and they were very early supporters of Hitler. They engaged in slave labor. The family actually pivoted in the 80s because they hired an American to take over their investment strategy. They moved away from the chemical industry and basically engaged in a monopoly playbook where they roll up an industry. They see a competitive market and they buy a bunch of companies. So what they did in coffee is they're actually doing that now in veterinary care. So they bought over like 1,500 American veterinary clinics. So essentially, concentrate in industry and then gouge. Or for the coffee industry, it's more about gouging coffee farmers, underpaying them. But that family, they turns out a few years ago, the British tabloids were reporting on their dark Nazi past. And so the family did a study, came clean, promised we wouldn't do this again, gave some money to charity. And then right before I went to press, it was reported by the Wall Street Journal that they still sell coffee in Russia. They're one of the few American companies not to leave. And to me, Putin is the closest thing we have to a modern day fascist. And if you're still doing business with him, your words mean nothing. So that is like my big point of that chapter. Not only that, but also what we lose from consolidation. It's like part of that chapter too is I talk about my mom's bakery. On so much of this era and this moment has stripped us of our humanity. Monopolists don't care. It's running a business by Excel, not through a human touch.
Mm. And do you think it's over time we become more complacent? I mean, how do we forget like monopoly and that connection between monopoly and fascism until it has to get painful again?
Where does it sound? I kind of view this all as cyclical. I think markets naturally concentrate, and then we're like, okay, this has gone too far. Like we just guilt stage moments, and then those usher in reform eras because monopolists always go too far. And I really think we're having that happen now. I mean, big tech. That's actually why I think Cargill is such a powerful monopolist. Is they're hidden. You don't really know who they are, and they don't overpush it. I think they overpush it. But they're the largest private company in America, yet most Americans have never heard of them.
Mm-hmm. In the introduction to the book, you describe how your home state of Iowa visibly changed as industrial agriculture took over. You say the most jarring change is that the animals have disappeared from view. We talked a little bit about the hog farming, and that this change may not be obvious to people who've never lived adjacent to farmland, especially because food marketing still portrays this nostalgic ideal of pastoral farms and how our food animals maybe live. Can you tell us about that change between the Iowa of your youth and now?
Yeah. To me, Iowa is a canary in the coal mine. Iowa has some of the world's best soil. It should be the Italy of North America. Yet, it's the second highest cancer rate in the country. One of the most obese states. Rural communities are producing the most they've ever produced, but none of that wealth is staying there. It's being extracted out. I almost view Iowa now as like an extraction colony, kind of like the coal industry was to West Virginia in the 19th century. And we shouldn't be shocked that the politics of anger is filling that void. Because it used to be family farmers are now low-wage workers for these robber barons. So a hog baron does 5 million hogs a year, 7,000 employees. These are low-wage jobs. And also, they're pretty awful, cruel jobs. They're traumatic. Like, instead of being your own boss, taking care of your animals on your land, your job now essentially is you go into these metal sheds and haul out the dead bodies. About 10% of pigs die in these things. The animals aren't happy, and the sows especially. And so I saw it happen in my lifetime. And it took me leaving Iowa and coming back to realize this is not right. It was actually my spouse who pointed out to me that most lakes in Iowa are closed in the summer. They're too dirty. It's like anywhere between 60 to 70% of the waterways in Iowa are just too polluted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Eric Schlosser writes the foreword to Barron's, and he wrote, "The way in which the United States produces and distributes its food has a profound effect on worker rights, as you just mentioned, animal welfare, air quality, water quality, the landscape, rural communities, public health, international trade, and the global climate. Food intersects everything," he's saying. And you say in the introduction to the book, our food system may not get a lot of attention in political debates, but it has a profound impact on who we are and the way we live. Do you think our collective attention is shifting? Will food be more important in, for instance, the upcoming election cycle?
Well, first, let me just say, it was such an honor and kind of surreal to have Eric write my forward. Fast Food Nation, everyone has that book growing up, that your first adult book you read that shapes you, and Fast Food Nation was mine. And it's almost ironic, or a twist of irony, or I'm not sure the right word here, but I read it working at a fast food joint in high school.
It's awesome.
Yeah. So it's like, I still get nervous talking to him. And my mentor and all this of what to expect when you write a book like this, how industry will push back, how to research. I uncovered an undocumented worker that died on my Dairy Barons farm. It took me 2 years of reporting, investigating, all that to get the details on that. But to your question on food stuff right now in this current election cycle, I think grocery store prices are everything right now. I think it's really President Biden's campaign reelection. And I truly think in food, you see one of his best political appointees and one of his worst. I think the appointment of Lena Khan is one of his best. And I think the appointment of Secretary Vilsack is one of his worst. The fact is the meat markets have gotten more concentrated these last 4 years. And it's one of the most bipartisan things, as we mentioned earlier, to reform these movements, but he hasn't done anything. It's because he's a former industrial dairy lobbyist who, in my opinion, wants to be a lobbyist again. So he is sacrificing the president's reelection chances for his personal gain.
One of the policy ideas that is really important in the book is the history of the Farm Bill. And early on, you set up a framework dividing what you call the New Deal Farm Bill from the Wall Street Farm Bill. Can you explain that and talk about the importance of the Farm Bill today?
Yeah. So that was the first part of the book I started writing. I worked on this book for 5 years, and part of it was just so much language now, it's designed to keep people out. Even that phrase, consumer welfare standard, I said earlier, it's not that complicated of a thing, but it sounds smart. And so the Farm Bill to me is a lot like that. It's so researching it, you realize that original New Deal Farm Bill comes out of the Dust Bowl. It was the markets were glutted because of World War I. Farmers were engaging in destructive environmental practices, but they were doing so in order to save their land. And so in order to stabilize things, we basically created this Goldilocks system where, sure, you get crop subsidies, but you have to essentially move land out of production and engage in conservation practices. So there was a carrot and a stick, and there was also a limit on how much you could get. So I was trying to figure out that sweet spot. Here's the thing, and I tell this story through Cargill. The Cargill family hated this. Cargill's, their whole job is to move and process as much grain as possible. And so, from day one, they started financing their opposition, trying to oppose it, including financing lawsuits taken up to the Supreme Court. What I focus on the 1996 one is that's where that system really broke, and it flipped to a system we have to today, where now the system is designed to overproduce grains at the expense of everything else. So if you grow carrots, you don't get anything. But if you grow corn, oh man, there's everything. So take crop insurance. When most people hear crop insurance, they think it's for a rainy day like that. But instead, it's really it's insurance for low prices. So 60% of the premium is paid for by the taxpayer. On top of it, there's no cap on it anymore. And it's Bill Gates is one of the largest owner of farmland in America, so you can get as much crop insurance as you want to grow corn. These programs aren't interconnected. So you get all this insurance to do corn, but then you're not required to do conservation programs. On top of it, a lot of these confinements, you can get, quote, conservation dollars to build a hog manure lagoon. They're just really rotten. Again, because it's all about moving and processing grains. Cargill wants to make as much corn syrup as possible. And part of that chapter 2 is what are the societal impacts of it? To me, the obesity crisis in America is rooted in this. It's a structural thing. It takes money to be healthy in this country now.
One of the things, maybe I do want to follow up for a second. What about the current farm bill that's up for approval sometime. It's being discussed now. I think they called it the 2023 Farm Bill at first, but they're still working on it. What about that? Are there changes in there that you find hopeful or things that you think should change still?
No, it's a status quo bill. I'm actually at the point
okay.
now that I think it's actually agriculture's second largest contributor to climate change. And that system perpetuates the destruction to the climate. I think we should just take those 3 programs, commodity, crop insurance, and conservation, and just make one big conservation program. We should stop picking favorites because right now we favorite corn at the expense of produce. Here's a pot of money for doing different things for your land. Let farmers decide. But I think the government should get out of doing this price support stuff.
One of the things that you illustrate so well in the book is how these huge corporations, these barons, can easily pay to change public perception, whether it's settling lawsuits instead of changing unfair tactics or painting the picture of the food system that they think consumers want to see. One of the things you talk about is something you call small washing. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, this one, there's a really good reporter that wrote some articles on this, so I have to give credit to. So I should also let me back up and say, when we travel, I love going to grocery stores. It's one of my favorite things. If I see a new product, I always buy. Like, that's my version of indulgence. But I would notice, I was reading those articles, and even traveling, you would see something being advertised as local and small, but I would see it in Maine, and I would also see it in Arkansas. And you're like, what's going on here? And you just realize, oh, this is kind of like astroturfing. Like, this isn't really local. A lot of times, too, it's a big company pretending to be a little brand. It's rampant because companies know that's usually what consumers want in a premium brand. Is they want to feel special. They want to make it feel unique. And so part of why I don't think people realize the concentration crisis in the American food system is there's all this illusion of choice, these different brands. And so that's kind of what the small washing is going into. It's exploiting the goodwill people have towards local at the expense of people who are actually doing it right. I mean, that is truly one of the big things in my book is the system. When these playing fields aren't level. So people doing it right are running uphill, and you can only run uphill for so long.
And one of the things you talk about as far as monopoly and this illusion of choice is how a corporation will have the different price points, the same thing basically offered at fancy, medium, and low prices. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So honestly, that comes from my dad. My dad and my grandpa actually were both beer salesmen. My dad did gas stations in town. My grandpa did grocery stores. So I grew up in that beer merchandising world. And so after school, he'd pick me up and we'd go stock shelves. And he would always just explain to me, that awesome, this is the Blue Moon store. You know what I mean? There's different income consumers like to buy different price products. Because that Whole Foods consumer too wants to think they're getting a different product than the Dollar General consumer, even though it's probably the same product. That whole income inequality stuff. What are we going to say?
And maybe made by the same company, right? And
totally. I mean, my favorite little example is there's a peanut butter monopoly. One company, Smucker's, has a 50-60% market share in peanut butter. They own a bunch of brands, but the market share is actually probably higher because they do a lot of store brands. We just don't know which ones they do. We only know which ones they do is when there's a peanut recall.
In the Grain Barons chapter, you mentioned that Cargill and companies like it have turned to funding research as a way of marketing. You say the goal is to muddy the waters regarding the health and environmental impacts of the company's products and ultimately influence policy. And it made me wonder if these corporations spend so much working to drive policy and legislation in their favor, how can that influence be countered?
Honestly, it reminds me of the tobacco industry. That's what they're doing. They're flooding the zone. They're trying to muddy the waters. I talk about that too in my Dairy Baron chapter. There's something called checkoffs, where farmers have to pay a tax into their commodity to advertise them. Here's the thing: most of them don't matter. Most of them are good. There's 20 or 30 of them. There's a Christmas tree one, a popcorn one, but dairy's a different beast. Dairy's a $600 million industry. The checkoff is. So your got milks come out of it. And what they realize is these advertising campaigns really didn't work. What they do now instead is essentially finance junk science. So this industrial dairy model is really bad for the climate. So they're essentially financing all this junk science to say, oh, it's actually good for the climate. Here's manure digesters. And as we privatize our land grants, this corporate money is filling that void. And so they're just trying to essentially maintain the status quo by flooding the zone because they win when we're not paying attention and we don't change the system. So that is kind of, to me, the bigger thing going on here.
Yeah, and when we're talking about the grain barons, for instance, and we're talking about corn, we're not just talking about corn or even animal feed, right? We're talking about sweeteners, right? And you discussed the connection between grain and the obesity epidemic. Do you think that the current focus by nutrition and medical professionals on the harm caused by highly processed food could influence the food system as a whole?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's actually why it's becoming a bipartisan issue. I've heard people all over the political spectrum talk about this. Books on the subject are doing blockbuster numbers. Also, I mean, it's just kind of how I think underappreciated too what the system is. It makes bad tasting food. Even writing this book, I would do a little taste testing. So I'd have people drink pasture milk, and then I have them drink industrial milk, and then my dairy baron's milk, Fairlife. And it's just inputs matter in food production. What a cow eats really impacts the output. And this processed food, when you eat it, you just don't feel good after. I mean, my big thing is like when I travel for work, it's so hard to get good food in an airport. You pay through the nose, and then it's just, you feel bad. Whereas like after you eat a good meal, you feel good. I think that's something more and more people are seeing. I think it's going to help drive system change. But also too is, let's never forget too, this food made in factories is engineered to be addictive. So it's like hard. I mean, I personally, once I have one cheese, I can't stop. But I know it's bad for me, and I try to avoid it.
And yet in the Grocery Barons chapter, you say, for instance, you may not shop at Walmart, but that doesn't mean that its decisions don't affect the options available in your grocery store shelves. So if we're controlled in what we're able to buy because the Grocery Barons and others are filling the shelves with what they want us to eat, I mean, how do we get to a point where that non-processed food is more accessible?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big thing with Walmart is I didn't originally plan to write about Walmart. I figured I found a lot of critiques of Walmart to be kind of classist. But once you start studying the grocery industry, you're like, oh, Walmart's everything. I mean, Walmart sells 1 in 3 groceries. There is no one in their league. I mean, their market share is the same as the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th combined. The thing about Walmart is it's kind of like the creation of one robber baron creates other barons. I mean, Driscoll's became a berry baron because they saw the rise of Walmart. They realized one company wants 4 berries year round for 4,000 stores. Walmart doesn't want to deal with a local vendor. It'll put on a good advertising show. Oh, here's this local thing we have. But it really doesn't want to have, unique onion vendor for each store. That's not how these systems are designed. And so it actually needs so much of the grocery store space anymore. It wants processed food because it's part of its tentacle system. It allows it to be shipped to one state and then shipped to another to a store. So part of it is to allow this new, better local system to emerge. There's a few things that have to happen. One is just I'm a big believer in using procurement to drive supply chain system, to change that. Schools, colleges, they buy a lot of food. How do we get people doing it right paired up with those institutional contracts? That's one of my big things I tell people is you don't change the system with your fork. If you really care about these vendors doing it right, help them with those contracts. Because putting local green pepper in a Dollar General is not going to change anything. Because also these systems are so skewed. But on top of it, I mean, even something simple as what you see in the grocery store shelf, there's all these games going on. There's all this bribery, essentially, like buying off what you see. And we can end that practice.
Mm-hmm. So institutions lobby, if you're a parent, maybe talk about school lunch, having local food It's
politics. Also, it's good for the climate. I mean, who doesn't want all milk served in Wisconsin come from Wisconsin dairy farmers, from cows on grass? You stabilize the people doing it right and copy and paste them.
Mm-hmm. It's a good point. What is there a region that you feel like is doing it right?
My instinct is always to say Wisconsin. And I think part of it, an underappreciated thing too, is there's the gender dynamics of all this stuff. Most of my robber baron men, a lot of sustainable farmers can be more female. And what I noticed in Wisconsin is it's a lot of daughters that took over their dad's dairy operation, and they just don't like that production model. So they're moving to a more sustainable system. And that state has such a progressive legacy too, where so much of those reforms in the New Deal started in Wisconsin. So that's actually why I'm a big believer in do the stuff locally and then brag about it. Or
co-ops too, right?
Yeah, co-ops. I mean, Wisconsin has that great co-op history. but a lot of schools a lot of people are doing this right. It's just how do we scale them? Because it's that Square subsidized pizza. There's just so much more sorry, I said the word subsidized already, but there's so much more subsidies going into that than a locally grown, cattle.
Mm-hmm. I often ask guests about the agency of individuals, and we've started talking about this already, that individuals can have as eaters and consumers, because the common narrative makes it seem like we can fix climate change or societal injustice just by buying or eating the right thing. And it was refreshing to read you say that we can't eat our way to the solutions to our food systems problems. In fact, you say the reality is any solution to these problems that does not directly challenge power is doomed to failure. So what do we do instead? You talked a little bit about those institutions. Do you have other ideas of where to get started?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is from a more DC level. I think I really want to have a conversation over USDA. I'm kind of at the point now stripping it for parts. By every metric, they fail. For every dollar you spent at the store, the farmer gets lowest ever recorded. They're failing workers, they're failing eaters. They're only helping Cargill at the end of the day. So let's take away its antitrust authority and it has a carve out on the meat industry. Let's give it to the Federal Trade Commission. It's just shown it's incompetent at doing its job. Maybe taking away food stamps and giving it to HHS, like that kind of stuff. I'm also there's an interesting coalition forming to end the Farm Bill as we know it. I mean, the Cato Institute just came out with a report basically saying we should sunset the Farm Bill as we know it. The crop insurance is such a corporate giveaway. So that's another idea. And I actually find too, focusing on the positive, the procurement stuff is actually what motivates people the most. The world's dark right now. People want hope. What could it be?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. I love that idea. I mean, I think how can you overcome a really intractable issue if you can't actually envision what it should look like? You said something about, returning to nostalgia and, fixing a broken food system. But I think you say, was it ever correct before? You can't fix something broken if it wasn't ever correct to start with, I think is something that you say in the conclusion to the book. So yeah, is there a process to envisioning what a food system might look like that you have started?
Yeah. My big silver lining hope right now is actually ethanol is going to die and it's going to happen pretty soon. I personally think ethanol has been one of the most destructive things to happen to the Midwest. It's really hurt cattle farmers because it's a lot of cattle land got taken out of production and put into corn production. The Biden administration has been really aggressive at transitioning the American auto fleet to EVs and hybrids. Most people don't realize, but the largest use of corn now is ethanol. So as that transition happens, that market's going to collapse a lot, fast. So what are we going to do? I should also say an underappreciated thing is there's been a lot of row crops will probably soon be robotics. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, you go to a farm show now, these tractors are essentially driving themselves. Here's the thing. There's only so many cows one person can look at on land. You can't do robotics like that. So how do we take animals out of this metal shed and put them back on the land? So as this corn land is no longer needed, let's put the land back in the pasture. Makes it better tasting product. It's better for the environment. It's better for rural communities. Honestly, it's kind of one of the true win-wins you have out there. That's what I want to focus on is the system. I mean, I joked to someone the other day. I mean, driving in Iowa now to me is like driving the New Jersey Turnpike. It's just so industrial. The countryside, you don't see any animals in land. You smell them, but you don't see them. And it's just getting away from this system.
So I'm just imagining now the bottom falls out of corn because ethanol goes away and people are anti-corn syrup. They don't want to eat sugary foods. So there's farmlands are available, but it's all owned by people like Bill Gates. Are they going to pivot quickly enough to make something happen?
These things are going on right now that to me are just fascinating. I don't think are underappreciated is one. I mean, Ted Cruz won the Iowa caucuses in 2016 opposing ethanol. There's not this even people in Iowa know we know it's a farce. Mm-hmm. Anyone that believes ethanol is good for the climate in 2024 believes the world is flat. The other thing too that I think is really going to drive this is you have an old-fashioned European land war going on right now with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Ukraine's such a massive grain production area. We know what happens in history when this is going to cause food prices to spike. We know that destabilizes governments. At the same time, you have the Biden administration doubling down on ethanol. You cannot have your cake and eat it too. You can't lose all this global land supply and at the same time reduce farmland by burning it in your cars. I think it's clearly contributing to the rising prices in the grocery store. So that to me is like one of the biggest things right here is this election will be determined on a few people in a few states. And it's going to be over grocery prices. It's not going to be over ethanol.
Well, fascinating. Well, Austin, thank you so much for talking with us.
And thank you so much for having me on. Just one last note I want to say is how much, first of all, the work you guys do is like the system, it's the positiveness of like what the system could be, but also local is what maintains culture. I think that's been lost is this homogenization and stripped us of our culture. That local business is the one that maintains that stuff. And people really crave that and they want that. It makes a place. And so I just want to like make that final point is I think a lot of people see that, miss that, and want that.
Yeah. So local food, local regional systems is kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Local restaurants. I mean, even something simple as like my hometown's known for its kolaches. We have a large Czech population. Like we even have kolaches at our wedding instead of wedding cake. And it's like the local bakeries that keep that tradition alive. Walmart's not going to carry a kolach.
Well, yeah, I think that, we saw during the pandemic just how tenuous and fragile these big systems are. And when we also have local production and regional access to things that don't have to depend on these barons, maybe we have more food security as well.
Yeah, I mean, the thing to keep in mind, when these supply chains get long, they get fragile, transparency collapses, so exploitation takes place, and they don't taste good.
All right. Well, thanks again. We're so glad to have you, and best of luck with the success of the book.
Yeah, thanks again for having me on.
We've been listening to author and antitrust expert Austin Frerick. Thank you for joining us today at Eat, Drink, Think. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and don't forget to pick up your local edible magazine. You can find show notes for today's episode at ediblecommunities.com.